Welcome, everyone. My name is Mercedes Piedra, and I am one of the directors in the Office for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at UC Davis Health in Sacramento, California. Thank you so much for attending. We have quite the esteemed panel here today to be able to lift up the solidarity needed during this time for our Asian American community. As we all know, since the pandemic has started, we have had a dramatic increase in hate crimes towards our Asian American communities. And our esteemed colleagues that are on this panel today are going to be able to bring their expertise into this room so that everyone can hear what the effects are happening to our Asian American communities, also educate, but learn, but in addition to take action and the support that we're going to be having through the panelists today. We have Dr. Henry Tan, who is our Associate Vice Chancellor for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at UC Davis Health. Also, we have Council Member Mai Vang, who is a daughter of Hmong refugees from Laos. She is a proud Sacramentan and eldest child of 16 children. And so that's a beautiful arrangement there of a great family. Before her election to represent Sacramento's 8th City Council District, Vang served as the Executive Director for the Buck Scholars Association, an organization that provides mentorship and scholarships to talented high school students who lack the resources and support to achieve their educational goals. She also teaches in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the California State University, Sacramento, and the Department of Asian American Studies at UC Davis. Also, we have Dr. Marilyn Wong, and Dr. Marilyn Wong has had an extensive background in activism in 1969 at the height of the anti-Asian war and Black Power movements. She had such a huge work in that effort. She now centers her work on postpartum justice and the AAPI community healthcare workforce pathway development. She is retired from clinical practice as a physician and is currently pro bono Executive Director of Mothers for Mothers Postpartum Justice Project, serving the Black maternal health commonly in Oakland and San Francisco. She is also Vice President of UCSF's Medical Alumni Association Board. We're glad that she's here. And our final panelist for the day is our very own Kim Ngo. She comes from a large extended family of former Vietnamese refugees in San Jose. She graduated from UC Berkeley with a public health degree and worked at a FQHC before attending UC Davis. She will be heading to UC San Francisco this summer for her family medicine residency, and we are so extremely proud of her. So thank you, panelists, for being here today and the work that you've continually done. So to start our session, we just want to know a little bit more about your efforts in the work that you've done over your lifetime in support of justice, and specifically in the current events of the anti-Asian racism that's happening today. And so Dr. Tan, we're going to open with you.
Thanks, Mercedes, for that great introduction. And before I start, I just want to say how honored and humbled I am to be a part of this incredible panel of people who've made such tremendous impact on the community at large, and specifically the Asian American community. I'm a refugee. I'm a Vietnamese refugee, and that's where I draw a lot of my own personal passion and strength when it comes to social and racial justice. I grew up in an environment where there actually was quite a bit of anti-Asian racism, suffered both emotional and physical scars as a result of anti-Asian bullying as well. But really, you know, those experiences really inspired me to look at, you know, there must be something more. There must be something more than just the pain, the poverty, the exclusion. And that was really the seed to my work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also went to UC San Francisco and cut my teeth in San Francisco General Hospital, which we worked to improve the health of underserved communities there. And then came to UC Davis and started with some colleagues an Asian-specific mental health community clinic for APIs that were underinsured or uninsured. And this clinic was part of the Asian Pacific Community Counseling's Transcultural Wellness Center. Right now, I serve as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Health Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And the work that I and my team are doing is to both enhance our understanding, appreciation, celebration, and determination for diversity, equity, and inclusion internally, but also to really focus our health system and university to look at the roots of these health inequities in terms of the social determinants of health, poverty, lack of access to education, both at large, but in our very communities that are just a stone's throw away from 3 major medical centers. Dr. Wong, Kimberly, and I were just speaking before this that, as we look at the social influencers of health, we cannot forget the underlying reasons why there are differences in these social factors. And those differences are rooted in historical injustices and historical racism. And so that is also an area that's I feel a lot of resonance and passionate about. And it's important that we as a health system work to unpack our role in that history and to look forward and to look at our role in addressing those historical inequities in the here and now and in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. Councilmember Vane.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mercedes. And thank you so much, Dr. Tan, just for sharing your story. Hello, everyone. Happy Tuesday. It's really great to be here virtually in space with all of you, sending lots of love and healing your way. Just want to take this moment to thank the Office of Equity, Health Equity, Diversity, Inclusion for inviting me to be part of this incredible panel. I, too, like Dr. Tan, is just humbled to be part of this panel of incredible leaders on the ground doing work in the field to make sure that we truly don't leave any communities behind. I don't think my story is really unique in its own way. I think it's very common for, kids and daughters of Hmong refugees. I grew up here in the Sacramento region, growing up in poverty and actually living alongside many Blacks and Latinos. And I saw firsthand how the system was really, truly stacked against us in our community and how the system pitted us against each other. I grew up in Oak Park in Meadowview in Sacramento. Proud daughter of Hmong refugees and the oldest of 16 children in my family. And yeah, I mentioned a little bit about just growing up in poverty, but I truly, I think at a young age, really internalized poverty and wanted to leave Sacramento. I was the first in my family to go to college. And I share the story of wanting to go to college, not because I wanted a college degree, but because I wanted to leave Sacramento and I didn't want to be poor anymore. But it was actually, my transformation happened when I actually went to college at USF, and I read one line about the Hmong people. And actually, Professor Robin Rodriguez was supposed to be on this panel, and she was actually that professor when I was 18 years old when I entered her class. So it's really amazing to come full circle. I know she wasn't able to be on the panel today, but she was that one professor in sociology. And this is also a reason why I'm a big proponent of ethnic studies and Asian American studies, because it's really important for young people to understand and to learn their history, but not just Asian American students, but also, Black students, our Latino students, to learn about each other's histories and roots. And so I went to the University of San Francisco for undergrad, and then went to UCLA for grad school to get my master's in public health and Asian American studies. And the reason why I love Sacramento was because of poverty, but it's also the reason why I returned back home and to help my family and my community. And when I came back as a college student, I looked around and you know, there's one thing, you can go and get a college degree, but if you come back and your families and your communities are still struggling, we'll get us a college degree. And so I started organizing in South Sacramento to get families activated, involved in education, and making sure that they were at school board meetings involved in their children's education. And so me and a few young organizers got together and started HIP, Hmong Innovating Politics, to get our communities registered to vote and engage in the political process. And fast forward now, I'm on the Sacramento City Council, and we have a lot of work ahead. I think oftentimes growing up and as an organizer, I saw that oftentimes decisions were made for us, but never made by us, by people who actually understand or are living through the struggle. And so representation is incredibly important for me, but making sure that our communities have a voice at the table. I think, as all of you know, anti-Asian hate isn't something that's new in our community. There is an uptick in incident, and largely due to rhetoric from a previous administration who has really emboldened attacks against Asian Americans. And in this moment, Asian Americans are now in the consciousness of America. And we are in this moment where we ask ourselves, what are we going to do to rise up and to fight back? And I wouldn't say just even as a council member, I've been just inspired by our young people, activists and organizers who I will say have been doing this work for a very long time, but has not been seen, who's rising and who's fighting the good fight on the front lines. And so, you know, I look forward to working with them. Even though I'm an elected official, I believe that you got to have community-led solutions. It can't come from government. It's got to come from the people. So I will be following the people as I continue to uplift voices that are just not heard. They're there, but they're not listened to, and hoping that elected officials like myself and my colleagues and other electeds around the nation is listening now and making sure they're working side by side with community-based organization, young people and activists to truly create a world where everyone is seen, loved, and protected. So thank you again for having me on, and really looking forward to having this conversation with all of you.
Thank you so much, Mai. And Dr. Wong, I'm going to pass it to you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. And I just feel like I'm sitting in a living room with family members. So when I listen to Dr. Tong and I listen to Mai Vang, like these are familiar stories. Like these are also part of my story. I was an immigrant from Hong Kong. I came here when I was 11. We lived in San Francisco. And I guess my activism started in 1968, 69. I was a freshman. I was a freshman at, of all places, UC Berkeley, which was the hotbed of student activities. So it didn't take very long for me to realize, oh my God, I was a major in architecture, because in my simple mind, that was how I was going to improve the dilapidated housing in San Francisco, Chinatown, where my grandparents live and my relatives live. So, oh, that's how I was going to contribute to the community by having better design. So it didn't take very long for me to be in the Berkeley campus to learn, so, gee, it's not a question of design, and it's a question of economic and social and political inequity. That's the community, is the way it was. So I went on campus, as a freshman in 68, and by 69, I pretty much had dropped out. So thank you, Mercedes, for giving me credits for work that I didn't do, because I really didn't stay on campus for very long, but I was very much influenced by that period of time. So I think that the center of my talk today would be, this is a teachable moment for us. And we take advantage of every teachable moment, because teachable moments transform lives. They certainly transform mind, because when we have things that had always happened, but it's not in the forefront, we sort of take it for granted. You know, we live day by day. But then something will happen, and it happens always in history. Periodically, things will blow up in a way that we can't hide. You know, we can't shoo away from those events. And those are the time we would ask why. So back in the 60s, the question was, why am I seeing images of people dying in Vietnam, people that look like me? Okay, why are we, the United States, in a foreign land killing people? that looks like me in my name, right? So then, you know, that was the beginning. And then when you, then when sometimes you have convergence of events, and that's when things sort of blow up. So I think what we saw in this last year was the convergence of COVID. That was a big shadow over the entire country. And then we have the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020. Then we have the whole drama of the 2020 election. And then we saw what happened in the Capitol on January 6th. And then now the anti-Asian hate, all those violence had taken place. Again, you know, like what everybody said, it's not a new event, right? So these incidents had happened throughout history, but now the sight of the country is focused on it. So now we have somewhat of a platform, and then when you have a platform, you take advantage of that, because to be sure, it's not going to last forever. Just like Black Lives Matter is going to have its ebb and flow. So here's a chance that when more people are paying attention, and not just outside the community, just even within the community. I think for the AAPI community, we've had, it's very, very diverse, right? You and I, we all know that people come from all classes, come from all backgrounds. There are different reasons why people immigrated. There are different professions, people in different positions that people have in this country, and therefore they take on a different take on when things happen. You know, how do things align? Why things happen the way they happen? But this is the chance for us to exchange those informations, exchange our perspective, and rise up together, and to be able to understand how our history is actually linked with the history of all the other people that had come from many different parts of the world. So from that activism in 68, 69, I went back to San Francisco, Chinatown. I worked there for a number of years. We started a community health center. We had youth program. We had free clinics. We had senior programs. We had food program for mothers, summer youth program. So whatever the community need, and the need was great, you know, so we tried to do something. And I would say that was the best education I've had, you know, the years that I worked there. But after many years, then I begin to sense that I really want to have a specialty, so to speak, instead of like a jack of all trades. You know, I could run a printing press. I could run a childcare program. I could run a food program. But when I start looking at, well, what it is that I want to do for the rest of my life, for the decades that's going to follow, that's when I decided that I would like to concentrate to learn the skill in health, because I feel that's a skill that I could offer people without, you know, well, I think in that sense, it's a simple way, you know, so I have a skill, but, you know, as we know, medicine is, you know, you cannot just, cannot just freely provide it for free, because it takes so much of other supports in that system. And that impetus for that was just taking many people that came to the community center that needed to go see a doctor. So and Dr. Tarwood would know that San Francisco General is all the way out in the Mission. And if you're in Chinatown, to get out there, because, you know, if you go to the local public health office and you have something that need referral, you'll be seen at San Francisco General. And to make that trip is a good hour ride from Chinatown. And for a lot of residents, if you don't know the language, and in those days, and we're talking about in the 70s, there are no interpreters. But now there are laws that say all the health centers and all the health institutions need to have interpreter. That was not true in those days. So I would be taking a lot of Chinatown residents going out to San Francisco General. And what I learned was so important, because when I was riding on the bus with them, I hear the entire story. You know, what is it? The most important is what is it that they fear? In other words, they may have a skin rash, but what is it that is really bothering them. Maybe they think it's skin cancer. Maybe they think it's, whatever. And what surprised me is once you get to the hospital, well, there's usually a long wait, usually maybe an hour, 2 hours, sometimes even 3 hours. And then when they get into the office, the doctor will take one look. In 2 minutes, we'll be out of the office. And I know none of the questions that this patient had was answered or even get a chance to be asked, And I think that was when I first became interested in health. Because prior to that, I was going to be an architect. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so that's how I got on the journey of being a physician. And I didn't do that until I was in my 30s and after I had 2 children of my own. So for those young people, I can't see the images. So that's one problem with virtual. I can't see the audience. But for those who are the young people out there, don't ever think that you need to follow straight lines. Like you have to go to finish high school, go to undergrad, and then you go on to med school or go into professional school. So in fact, there are many ways of traveling through life, but always follow your heart. So
thank you, Dr. Wong.
I will stop there.
Yeah, I love what you're offering too, and your services to be in the community, riding the bus, being proximate, and really listening to folks so that they understand what is available for them, but that they're heard also. So thank you for that, Dr. Wong. Kimberly, I'm going to turn to you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you again for inviting me. I feel very honored to be a part of this distinguished panel. And just want to say, actually, I was born and raised in San Jose as the daughter of Vietnamese refugees, so kind of similar story to Dr. Tan and Mai. I kind of saw the influence of how history brought my family here to the United States and influenced how they viewed the world and how they approach healthcare. So when I entered UC Berkeley, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I liked history, but I like all this kind of thinking about social issues and things like that. And it was actually my freshman year of college when I met Dr. Wong in the student-run lecture series, where we had different speakers talk about health issues, but thought about it in a broader lens and thinking about all the social determinants, but also a lot about history. So actually Dr. Wong, I would say, is one of my role model and mentors since then that had kind of helped me learn more about myself, my role, what I can do in health. And throughout college, I've just been involved in different student organizations. One of them was being like a translator for monolingual Vietnamese women when giving birth, which was really amazing. And then after college, I actually worked at a federally qualified health center in Berkeley, Lifelong Medical Care, which is one of many health centers that came out of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And it was just great being there as an AmeriCorps member, kind of working with different programs in the community and seeing how an institution and in healthcare can do lots of things and promote social change. So that's why I ultimately decided, like Dr. Wong, to go into medicine for that opportunity to do what I can, of course, working with patients, hearing their stories, but also thinking about how can I promote and impact change in a broader sense. So during med school, I'll talk a little bit more during my presentation later, but I've been involved with lots of different things, lots of different organizations trying to promote access to care. And kind of in the API circle, I've been a part of the Asian American Medical Student Group, been local leadership and national leadership, and just been in conversation with lots of different folks, including students at UC Davis. And I want to give a shout out to all my classmates in the first, second, and third years. I think we're a very active, progressive bunch of folks who are always trying to figure out ways to organize and make change. And that's why I'm also looking forward for residency at, so family medicine residency at UCSF is mostly at SF General. So I'm really, really excited to be able to serve that underserved population there and take a lot of the lessons and the things that I've done here at Davis and Berkeley and before and pave it forward for underserved folks at San Francisco. So again, just kind of a brief overview of my trajectory, but really inspired and honored to be here today. So thank you.
Thank you so much, panelists. And so I hope the attendees are appreciating the expertise of our panels, but also the generational influence that is here on this panel. We do know that the history is embedded deep of racism against our Asian American communities, and it has been from the Chinese Exclusion Act that lasted 60 years in the United States. A lot of folks don't understand that, but the presentation later in this session by Kimberly and Dr. Wong will go into the solidarity and the history of solidarity with our African American community and our Asian community. And so just wanting to have the panel also speak of the challenges that is currently going on. You know, this hate has been historic for our Asian American communities and additional marginalized groups. What is the difference now? We know that we've come through the pandemic, but what do you see is a difference with the hate that's being inflicted currently in 2021? And I'll pass that to Dr. Tan.
Well, honestly, I'll say that I don't think that the hate is all that much different. And that's sad to say because it's horrible what we're seeing today. But I would say that this is something that Asian Americans have experienced for a long time. I do think what is the difference is the visibility and solidarity and support from other communities and the community at large. I think that that's what, as painful as it is to see these things in YouTube and other social media where, you know, it takes you right into that horrible experience, it has brought a level of visibility and acknowledgement to this issue. I think before it was almost as if it was a little bit of a gaslighting effect where, you know, you experienced it and then people ignore it and the bystanders sort of ignore it. And so you start to question, I must have done something. I must have caused this, or even maybe the hurt and the pain isn't as bad as I felt it to be, because no one else cared about it. No one else made a big deal about it. And so there was a lot of, I think, internalization in the past, whereas now, because of the incredible important work that BIPOC communities have done, and I really want to give a specific shout out to you know, members of our Black community and advocates who really, I think, have spearheaded the way, have really focused on racial equity and justice in ways that have been very painful for the community, but at the same time, very impactful for the Black community and the rest of us as well. So, so I think that it gives me a lot of hope, as much as even though I have experienced a lot of pain, it gives me a lot of hope that there is this recognition that even though we see bystanders still, like in what happened in New York last week or so, that there's still a larger community that says, this is not right. This happened, we acknowledge that this happened, and it is not right, and we need to do something about that. That, I feel, is the difference that we're experiencing today. And again, we stand on the shoulders of activists and advocates like Dr. Wong, like our colleagues in other communities of color, to be where we're at today, where our pain is visible and acknowledged and supported.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. Fang, Lai.
Yeah, I would say, you know, in the wake of ongoing protests for racial justice, because even at this height of consciousness of what's happening in the Asian American community, there was a George Floyd and BLM, right? And I think all of our communities, Black, Asian, Latino, Indigenous, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, I think everyone is really demanding change from institutions. There is a long and painful and racist history in this country towards Blacks, Asian Americans, and communities of color. And we've seen laws since the 1800s that have upheld white supremacy and have contributed to the anti-Asian xenophobia that we actually see today. Racism is also something that's very complex and multifaceted as well. And so it's not something that we're going to be able to change overnight, but I do believe there are some critical steps that as a community, we're seeing activists and community organizations beginning to change hearts and minds on the ground, right? So that we could truly create a better world. I will also say, let me just say that no one entity, not one elected, can address this issue alone. I do appreciate, I saw some legislation at the state level to address anti-Asian hate incident and tracking. And at the local level, you know, as a city councilwoman, you know, we passed a resolution to condemn anti-Asian hate and xenophobia, but that in itself is just a piece of paper. But that piece of paper is important, as I would say, because it's important for government entities to acknowledge the harm and trauma that have existed in our communities. But how we move forward, like I said, is going to be really critical in this moment, and how we actually put solutions forth, right? Right now, you know, my team and I are hustling and working hard to convene residents, Asian American residents, leaders together to talk about what are some tangible solutions moving forward. And, you know, there is a segment of the community that may want to say we need more law enforcement. And there's another segment of our community that say, for me, I would be part of that segment, is that I will not double down on a system that has not been helpful for our community. So how do we truly invest in community-led solutions and human investments in safe neighborhoods? That's the work that's ahead on the city level and on the governance level, but it has to be done with community partners on the ground. And so there's a lot of work ahead, but I believe there's a role for everyone, whether you're an elected official, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a neighborhood leader, a youth. I mean, racism, we have to be able to fight white supremacy in every angle, in every way, to change hearts and minds. And so it's going to take collectively all of us, not just folks from the Asian American community, but in solidarity with our Black siblings, with our Latino siblings, with every community.
Thank you, Mai. And so just want to pose the same question for Dr. Wong.
I'm certainly in agreement with all that been said. Yeah, so, and just give a perspective. So recently my work is with postpartum justice in the Black community. And how we got to that is probably an example of when we say unity, it cannot be in an abstract. It cannot be a solidarity statement, okay, goodbye. You know, so it's not something we revisit every 20, 30 years, you know. So we have to, one, keep a very curious mind in asking everything in our surrounding and everything that happens, why? And not just things that happen to our community, but also anything that we see that is unjust. So how we got to working in the Black community on postpartum justice was, there was a group of students, and again, I refer to the AAPI Health Research Group, and we call it APERC. And every year we would pick a social project, you know, a community project. And something that had always been in the back of my mind is that in the postpartum period, that tradition is so rich in the immigrant community. In every community, there's a name for that period. When you say that name, it conjures up the food that you would serve, the do and don'ts of that period. The Hmong has a rich tradition. The Korean, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, and Southeast Asian, you know, all those, you know, and of course, all over the world. But somehow in this country, there's the total desert. When you say postpartum, the first thing people think of is depression. Well, that doesn't exist in any other traditions. So there's no folk tales that say, well, you know, once you give birth, the boogeyman's going to get you, and you know, none of that. And when anthropologists studied that period, what they found that they never uncovered depression as a natural aftermath of giving birth. But in this country, in this society, that's all we could think about, and that's what people experience. We first, so we were working with a group of students, and the students mainly came from background like Kimberly here, they are many daughters and sons of immigrants. So I know that it takes just one generation to lose traditional wisdom. So people who come to this country, they may have certain traditional beliefs and knowledge, but in one generations, because we're so, oftentimes because we're made to feel ashamed of that culture and it's backward culture and it's backward knowledge, that we don't retain it. So we had a project where we encouraged the students to collect recipes, postpartum recipes from their relatives, from their moms, from their grandmoms, aunts, and I have to give a shout out to a student, Khan, who headed this project. So we collected these recipes and we published a small book. I didn't think to get a copy to show you, but it's a very simple, it's a student project. But what surprised us was on this publication, NPR picked it up. And on the very first day on their Facebook, they had 10,000 likes for that article that they print out on our book. So our curious mind then asked the question of why, instead of stopping to say, oh my God, we did a great project and, stop it at that. We asked, and that's to our credit, that we asked that question, was why? And that's when we discovered that in the United States, there's a postpartum cultural desert. And then that's when we uncovered one thing after another, that the maternal health inequity in this country is staggering. So Black women die at the rate 2 to 3 to 4 times, and in some cities 12 to 14 times higher than the white women. And this is the richest country in the world, and we spend the most money per capita on health. And this is the result, and that's the inequity we were seeing. So that was how we got involved with that work. And when I say when we work with other communities, it's also very important to be humble and to truly work together. So our project very, very quickly, it started out with that recipe book. We had a special course at UC Berkeley on postpartum justice, because we knew there was nothing at that time. This is about 2 years ago, and that's how quickly things move. Now it's quite a movement with a lot of mainstream media covering the postpartum period and maternal health. So we were able to, from that course, we were able to unite a lot of activists from the Black community on maternal health who were already working. So we recognized that we didn't have the knowledge to work in the Black community, but we recognized that there was an issue there, something that, so basically we went in with the mindset of what it is that the Black community need, what is it that we can do, okay? So the leadership was always in the Black community, so they lead our project in the sense of what needs to be done. So we may come up with this, well, what about this, what about that? But the answer would always come from the Black community to say, yes, okay, oh, that's a great idea. Or no, that would not work. We don't do things that way.
So really listening. Thank you so much, Dr. Wong. Thank you. So Kimberly, I'm going to turn to you.
Yeah, I really appreciate all the perspectives that everyone has given so far. I think I'll share a little bit about the student perspective in terms of thinking about how do we address all these bigger issues. And I think one of the things that has been most meaningful throughout my years at Berkeley and here at Davis is just the cross-cultural dialogue and being able to be in conversation with my peers. So I just think back to, for example, here at Davis, I was a part of the Asian American and the Southeast Asian student group. And we had representatives from other groups like the Latino group, the African American group, et cetera, et cetera. All these diversity groups come together every month. This was when I was a first and second year. We would come together with meetings at every month and think about all the different issues that'd be going on and host different workshops. So for example, one of the workshops my group did, I think, was talking about the Southeast Asian refugee experience and educating folks about that and how that impacts health. And likewise, realize other folks would do similar things. And I think one of the most important things is being open and humble, like Dr. Wong was saying, and also showing up to different things. So I would always make a point to make sure I would show up to my, like the LMSA events or the SMA events or all these other events from different student orgs to show that even though I'm not from that community, I'm there, I'm open to listening, open to learning. I think that's really important, is that building that kind of community and that space and opportunity where people feel comfortable talking with each other, asking these important questions and being able to reflect on what can I do to help this community, even though I'm not from that community, but being a good ally and seeing what are opportunities to bridge all these different gaps and work together to create collective change. So that's just kind of my reflection as a student.
And
Thank
Mercedes,
you.
can I add something really quick? So I want to give an example, right? Because we're talking about anti-Asian hate and racism, but we're also in another pandemic. We're still in the COVID pandemic, right? And as we're thinking about health equity and access, you know, I represent an area in South Sacramento that has the zip code 95823 in the city of Sacramento and in the county, the largest cases of COVID in the city and in Sacramento County. And when vaccines were rolling out, they were, the vaccination pop-ups were happening in wealthier neighborhoods. I mean, if you're going to do a vaccination pop-up, it should be in the zip code hardest hit. And so my team and I fought hard to secure vaccines from the county. And now we have a weekly clinic at the Sam and Bonnie Pannell Meadowview Center. And we first did our first clinic. Actually, this Friday will be our 1 month anniversary since we did a pop-up vaccination. There was a reason why our numbers looked very different from other vaccination pop-ups. 90% of our folks were Black, Latino, Southeast Asian, Pacific Islander, Indigenous community, with over 52% of folks limited English speaker. And there's a reason why, because we were incredibly intentional about outreach. And so my office, you know, even though I'm an elected official, I have an organizer, heart and hat. And we worked with, you know, our trusted messenger and 14 CBOs on the ground to actually do the intentional outreach. Because, I mean, when we're talking about COVID, we're also talking about digital access, digital equity, right? Who can register online for an appointment? They can't. And so we're having CBOs doing the filling, doing the phone calls, registering people via online. And so we were able to have those numbers. And that was done through collaboration with our CBOs, Black, Latino, La Familia, our churches, you know, the API network, HIP, HIFU, Immune Community Services. And our clinic is actually, here's another part of government, is that when you're rolling out vaccine, no one thought about the infrastructure to make sure that it actually happens and roll out in a way that's equitable. And so everything that we've been doing has been literally people-powered vaccination clinic, no pay, and everyone volunteering to be able to make it happen, right? And so I want to share an example of that, right? Like that in itself, because we are still in COVID. And, you know, even though when we're thinking about anti-Asian hate, a lot of it speaks from the rhetoric from the previous administration, right? Asian Americans as seeing as a public health concern. When we think about the PAGE Act or the first immigration law that prohibited Asian women and Chinese women into this country, was because you know, America didn't want them to reproduce, were stereotyped as prostitutes. They were seen as a public health concern. We're seeing that now. I mean, history repeats itself, right? And so, you know, we have a lot of work ahead, but I wanted to share that example because I do believe in solidarity and collaborative work. That's how we're gonna be able to solve and disrupt a system that hasn't worked for us, is when we come together. And so I wanted to share that example. And it's moments like that that makes me incredibly hopeful for the future, when communities can come together.
The collective effort for the collective impact. And yes, UC Davis helped in the distribution. We were one of the 14.
Yes,
yes,
UC Davis was. So
yes.
Y'all got a lot of nurses and doctors that came out and, you know, administering vaccination. And I'm just so grateful. So if y'all, I'm just going to put a shout out right now, because we have 3,000 doses this Friday and we're looking for volunteers. And I'll make sure to send that information. Maybe I'll put it in the chat box or send it to y'all, but we're looking for volunteers, non-medical and medical, to help us. And if you speak another language, that would be great as well. So I'll put a plug in for that.
No, please. And so important, right? I mean, those inequities continue, and those inequities are based on the racism that consistently has happened through all our history. We can just see it every single day. And so I'm just going to zone in a little bit on some of your work also on the initiatives for anti-Asian hate, right? And so putting proposals forth. And for the panel, what are some of the initiatives that you've been able to institutionalize or see the institutionalization of some of the efforts that have been successful? And so since you're on.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with one. I mean, the first step was that resolution, but we are now going to be convening Asian American residents and leaders to talk about what are some tangible solutions. One, I think when we think about just reporting and tracking, the city of Sacramento started something a little different. We developed the Department of Community Response. So instead of calling the police, moving to more a preventative model, right? And looking at ways in which the Department of Community Response can actually expand its capacity to be able to do more preventative work. So that's one. The other piece is, even though as I'm an elected official, I truly believe that community has the solutions. And in these conversations, they will be informing how the city moves forward, or at least that, because intentionality matters in how we move forward. And what we've been doing in the past has not worked for our communities. And so it's going to be incredibly important that we allow community to lead and tell us exactly what they need. If that's investment in people, in our senior programs, in our youth, then we need to make sure that we really listen to that and not do a top-down approach, which is what we often see in government entities. And then I would just say, something as simple, if you take Asian American studies, right, as disaggregated data, something as simple as that is still a barrier even in government. We're in 2021 now. And even in the city of Sacramento, I've been pushing for that, because when data is presented, we don't see disaggregated data of Asian Americans. And how can we tailor solutions to the Asian American community if we don't even see the numbers, right? Something as basic as that is incredibly important, so that all level of governments should be disaggregating data so that we can tailor programs and services. The other piece is also language access. And I will say this also, it's on record. I'm also going to be pushing to make sure that, during city council meetings, that we have interpretation. We're in 2021 and we don't have that in this moment. Some of our school district has that, which is great. They have interpreters on site pre-COVID, but even now during Zoom, there's an ability to do translation over Zoom. We should have that ability at the city of Sacramento. That's an injustice. And so I'm going to be pushing for that as well. And so when I talk to, community advocates on the ground, I mean, there's been rallies and protests, which is incredible. It's great because we have to be able to push the button on that. But it's also what we're going to do long term. Like, how are we going to sustain this and push for policy change for our communities? And so if you're out there protesting, that's awesome, but we're going to need you at City Hall and every public segment to make comments, to push, to make sure that our communities get resources.
Thank you. And I think that is one of the biggest differences, that we can now see where people can move right into the work of the political action, the activism, volunteering at the clinic, but definitely wherever we know and we see and we experience those inequities, for our allies to speak up. Right? This is the action. This is a call to action that we all need to be engaged more than ever, and definitely the multicultural, multi-ethnic collective impact. I'm going to turn to Dr. Tan, just because he's done so much work here at UC Davis Health, the initiatives that you've led, Dr. Tan, to eradicate a lot of the racism, the anti-hate. So.
I want to riff off as well what Maya was saying about the importance of solidarity. There was a question in the chat about, some of the incidents have been perpetrated by people from underrepresented communities as well. And I just wanted to also address that. The challenge here is that when you're in a neighborhood where there are few resources, we end up competing against each other for those precious few resources. And in the reality, it's not that we should be competing with each other, but we should be in solidarity, demanding that the neighborhoods get more resources. And this is exactly what happened with COVID-19 and the demands that Councilwoman Vang and others have done, was to say, you know what, we're not going to fight for the scraps. We're going to demand that there's a change in policy that allocates just resources for COVID-19, and we're going to get people involved, and we're going to work interculturally, across traditional ethnic lines, because we're all in this together, and we won't be put in a position where we're competing with one another. That is, that's the long-term picture I think that Councilwoman Vang was referring to. And this is something that we at UC Davis are committed to doing. So we have an initiative called AIM for Community Health, Anchor Institution Mission for Community Health. We recognize that part of our mission to improve health has to do with improving the social and economic circumstances of our neighborhoods. And so what that means is we need to expand beyond the clinics to look at how we as a health system, as a hospital, can impact jobs, can impact neighborhood safety, can impact access to education. These are things, you know, UC Davis, we have, you know, just at the health system, over 13,000 employees. We can do more in a systematic way to reach out to communities, to help partner with community colleges, with Sac States, with our high schools, to make sure that that we provide with community guidance a pathway to sustainable jobs. We should be and are working on developing business relationships with small businesses in the communities, because if we can funnel the money that UC Davis has into the community, into small businesses, that's going to elevate the social circumstances. That's going to elevate the resources within the communities. And again, I want to really riff on Councilwoman Vang's point that when, you know, we have to follow the community's lead on this. You know, it's not our money to say, hey, you have to do this with the money. It's really about investing in resources, and then the community decides how those resources are best used to improve the experience of the neighbors, the well-being, both mentally, physically, and socially, the well-being of the community. So that's the AIM initiative that we are really focused on, to improve housing, to improve economic stability, to improve jobs, because we understand that that's going to improve health.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And Dr. Tan, even during the pandemic, one of the first things we did was to ensure that the community had a place to go. And so we had put this webinar together in 2 days and had over 300 people, because we know that when we gather together, it's health. We get our health from community, but leaning on the wisdom of the community, right? That's the diversity component for us. We can't come, as Councilmember Vang was saying, from one entity, from one elected official, from one group of people. And so when we lean on the community, we're able to grow in community. So with our next question, and Councilmember Vang, you only have a few more minutes, and so I'm going to want to get every minute out of you possible. And so with the work that you've launched and extensive work, the division, the constant division that we hear through media, you'll even see where they're highlighting more African American attacks on the Asian American community. And so the divisive language, which is, it's happened, but it's not overwhelming, because we know that the majority population has also attacked our Asian communities. And we are expanding, you know, our definition of Asian is also Southeast Asian. It's a wide demographic of individuals. We saw, you know, the majority community also attacking our Asian population over 2020, and one incident with Michael Lofthouse, who is a CEO of one of our tech companies here in Silicon Valley, last July even was throwing racial slurs at a family during dinner at a restaurant, and it was videotaped and what have you. But the division component, we have to be mindful, because that's a distraction also. The division of keeping us, the resources, you know, only limited, making sure that our minds or our focus is only on certain populations, but realistically looking at the white supremacy that you are lifting up and these divisive tactics that they have to keep us separate is really the brilliance of white supremacy. Would you like to highlight any of the division that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, let me just first share is that oftentimes stories of solidarity, there is like an erasure of stories of solidarity between Black and Asian. So let me just start with that, because if you really study history, you'll see moments where Black and Asians have come together to really address white supremacy. So everything from like Frederick Douglass, who spoke against the Chinese Exclusion Act while his own community was suffering from slavery and lynching, right? To Yuri Kochiyama, who fought alongside Malcolm X, to Black Americans who fought for the entry of Southeast Asian when 62% of Americans didn't want Southeast Asians to come over here after the Vietnam War, to the Stephon Clark shooting that happened in the city of Sacramento in my district, where Blacks and Asians got together for a unity circle to talk about how we began to move forward. So there are moments in history and even now of solidarity, and there is this intentional erasure of that story. And I think that is how white supremacy shows up. So I want to acknowledge that piece. The other piece is, I think, you know, as we are addressing anti-Asian hate and incidents that is perpetrated by individuals who are African Americans, it's important for us not to criminalize the Black community while we're addressing anti-Asian hate, right? It is possible to hold the trauma and the suffering of our communities and an individual accountable in terms of restorative justice, but we have to be careful that as we move forward, we're not creating the same kind of systems we're trying to fight against. And so as we are fighting anti-Asian incident, and if the perpetrator is African American, we have to be mindful that we're not criminalizing the entire African American community, that, you know, these are individual acts, and that's really important to acknowledge. And the divisive language, I mean, at the end of the day, that is how white supremacy operates. You know, we didn't get a chance to talk about the model minority myth, which I think many of y'all are aware of if you take Asian American studies or if you've been reading now, given just the height of anti-Asian hate. But the model minority myth in itself is a form of anti-Asian hate and racism. Let's just call it out for what it is, because the model minority myth, you know, paints a very harmful and inaccurate narrative that Asian Americans are a monolithic group, that we're successful, and that we don't experience racism. And what that does is mask disparities within our Asian American Pacific Islander community. When you have the largest wealth gap, when you disaggregate data in Asian Americans, that it masks that, right? And so let me be clear that the term itself was coined specifically and purposely to divide communities of color, and in particular to keep the Black community down. And so being a model minority has never helped Asian Americans. If anything, it's been a tool for racism. And so it's really important for us as Asian Americans to demystify that and to be able to call it out for what it is. And so I always start with the erasure of solidarity, because that has always existed. And then making sure that we are also calling out the ways in which the model minority myth is a tool for white supremacy.
Thank you, Councilmember Vang. So much more to unpack, and the history, reading the history, we are going to be putting quite a bit of resources in the chat for everyone to consistently educate and bring up the awareness, but also to take action. We're going to transition to our presentation with Kimberly and Dr. Wong. And Councilmember Vang, we are so appreciative of your time here. We know that you have another 1 o'clock appointment, so we were going to be mindful of that. Any last comments of hope and support?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. If y'all are watching this, spaces like this is really important, right? Learning about our own histories, unpacking what's going on. Even this webinar and holding space like this is healing for our community, and it's incredibly important. And just to know that the work doesn't end here in this webinar. I think all of you are doing work in your own community. So I just want to uplift that even if you're not on this panel, all of you probably have so much knowledge and experience to share with each other, with your neighbors, with loved ones. And so I just want to say, keep fighting, keep doing the great work that all of y'all are doing. But make sure to also take care of yourself, because this is definitely a marathon, and system change doesn't happen overnight. We're all going to need each other for the fight ahead. And so make sure that y'all are taking care of yourself and just sending lots of love and healing. And if I can be in space in person, I will give all of y'all hugs. I'm a big hug person, but given the pandemic, we got to be safe. And again, just make sure that you are all taking care of each other, and everyone, just take care of yourself, because we're going to need you for the long haul. So Thank you so much
Thank you
again.
so much, Mai. And we'll share your vaccine clinic information in the
Yes.
survey we'll send.
Absolutely. Volunteers and everything else. So people-powered vaccination clinic. So thank you, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye. So folks, we're going to transition into our presentation on the history of African American Black Asian solidarity. And I'm going to turn it over to Kim and Dr. Wong.
All right, so for this portion, just a heads up, Dr. Wong will give an overview kind of presentation before I go into my section. So.
Dr. Wong, you can unmute yourself.
Okay. All right, so we're going to do a very, very quick presentation just to give some of the background information of all the things that we've been talking about. So in 2021, at this very moment, we call this a teachable moment. In the past, in the 60s, there were a similar moment like this, and we used to have what we call teach-ins. And when you look at the webinar that we're having today, this is what we would call a teach-in. It's basically the gathering of people to share information that's outside of the mainstream media and outside of the mainstream institution. So there are two main points I want to share with you. One, and then this is something that we've discussed throughout this webinar, is one, United States is a multi-ethnic nation on stolen land. And this is a history that we must recognize and learn because it was never taught to us from that perspective. The second point being domestic and international events and history are intertwined because oftentimes we look at what's going on in our country and we look for domestic solutions. We look for linkages just domestically without recognizing the international connection. So first off, when we look at our history, we have to recognize that the United States was founded on certain fundamental beliefs. So when we talk about white supremacy and all that, it's not just a belief of some individuals, but it is something that is part and parcel of the system. So in the United States, we know, we all learn, right? In high school, we learned this concept of manifest destiny. We all learned that term. I don't know if this jogged your memory. And it was presented to us in a very benign way. And it basically, it gives white European settlers the divine right to conquer all the land from the east to the west coast. The question is, who gave them that right? But it was always couched in the sense that this was survival of the fittest. So the one who are fittest has the right to rule over others. But what that fittest, quote unquote, was not meant to say who has the most intellectual power or the creative power, but it was the color of your skin. If you have the right color of the skin, and if you have the gunpowder to back it up. So manifest destiny, we learned in history as something benign, but in fact, it was a license to commit genocide. And that same thoughts carry over in the Black history, that all the forefathers of the people who wrote the US Constitution and our founding father and all that, when they write, all men are created equal, they weren't being hypocritical because they in fact believe all men were created equal. It's just that Blacks were not men. They were subhuman in their eyes. So we have to understand that white supremacy is permeated and was founded within in this country. So it's the foundation. So the work that we have to do is there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the future. But this history we must learn. So we don't have time to go into any of these history. But I would say at a university such as UC Davis or any of the university, one of our main function would be to educate. And I would say it should be required course for us to learn everyone's history, for us to really thoroughly understand our own experience. Unless we understand the violence that had permeated throughout history, we would not be able to understand the anti-Asian violence currently. Because in the educational system, it's meant to gloss over that violent history, because they have to be able to keep the population ignorant enough to be able to support it, to support the white supremacy, to support the violence that comes from that. Because this US economic system goes through economic downturn periodically. It's built within the system. So in good times, there is enough crumbs to share, but in bad times, it's scapegoating. And scapegoating is the same song, be it 150 years ago to now, and even the lyrics are the same. So when in 2016, when Trump was wailing against the Mexican, well, that was almost the exact same words being used against the Chinese in the 1800s, that these were rapists. Well, these were violent people. These were dope pushers. These need to be gotten away out of our land. So we have to recognize the consistency of white supremacy and the consistency of the scapegoating that's being used throughout history. Now, that kind of scapegoating rhetoric, we could say, oh, it's just talk. But talk leads to action. It happened in the 1800s, and it happens in the 1980s. So 1880s it happened, 1980, and in between all that time, it happened. Vincent Chin, some of you may know of this case, and this case was very, very telling. So this is 1980. It's not something so long ago. But this young man was killed in Michigan by 2 laid-off auto workers who mistaken him for being Japanese, because in the 1980s, the US auto industry was going down in a downturn, mainly because it didn't keep up with time. So the Japanese auto industry was on the rise, but US would blame the Japanese auto industry for its own failure, the failure of the US auto industry. That permeates to the populations, to people who work in the auto plants, to have a hatred of anyone Japanese, but they cannot tell a Japanese from a Korean, from a Chinese, from a Filipino most of the time. So this young man, on the night of the night before his wedding, he was at a bachelor party for him, that he was killed. Now, the 2 white murderers were caught, were sentenced, were charged, and were sentenced. And what was their sentence? They had to pay $3,000. They have to serve 3 years probation with no jail time. So when there was an uproar as to why a murder would receive such a lenient sentence, the judge of the case, Judge Kaufman, this is exactly what he said. And it's very instructive to know this, because this is so succinctly summarized our justice system. So he said, these weren't the kind, these meaning the 2 white men, weren't the kind of men you would send to jail. You don't make the punishment fit the crime. you make the punishment fit the criminal. So in other words, white are not the kind of men you would send to jail. So you would have you could have the same crime, but if you were white, the punishment for white will be completely different if this is a crime committed by Black, by Latino, by any other ethnicity. So that is the truth of our justice system. And sometimes that same system get exposed. So when we have something like this happen in Georgia, and this is because it happened at the heel of the Black Lives Matter movement, that it got a certain amount of exposure that it cannot be swept under the rugs. It cannot be hidden. This same kind of teachable moments occur periodically in history. So in the 1960s, we had one of those movements and those moments. But that was also didn't happen in isolation. It was on the basis of all that had happened in the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement. That was the prelude to the student movements of that time. And that led to the forming of ethnic studies in all the major university across the land. It was a demand. It wasn't something the university gave in to readily. So there was a big fight for that. And the reason that I think there was victory for the fight on campus was because there was unity. So among the Chicano at that time, that's what the Latinx population were called, Chicano, the Native American, the Asian American, and the Black student movements. Some of the students stay on campus and fought for ethnic studies, and some of the students left campus and went into the community. So this is a picture of me here holding a banner in one of supporting the strikes among garment workers. And this was an International Women's Day celebration by the garment workers and electronic workers in San Francisco, Chinatown. Some of the students were involved with housing struggles and in healthcare. And I would say in healthcare is where the Asian American movement made the most contribution. Because if you were to look at any of the community health centers in major city, the Asian American community health centers, be it in New York City, in Seattle, in here closer by in Oakland, in Boston, they are now big health institutions, but every single one was started by student activists, Asian American student activists in the 60s and 70s. And they all started with simple thing like a health fair or a health screening. So that is an example of activists, students becoming activists through a teachable moment, and then in turn impacting their community. So I'm just gonna get to the second point very quickly, and that is domestic and international events and history are intertwined. So one of our most current events is gonna be COVID. So when we look at things in isolation sometime, it cannot make sense unless we really link it to the international. And it's also an opportunity for us to learn some of the history. So in COVID, we know that Asian Americans were disproportionately impacted by COVID for many different reasons. Now, one of the reasons is that there are many, many Asian American healthcare providers. In fact, a fifth of California's nurses are Filipino. Now, why are there so many Filipino professionals in California? Then we have to understand the history of the Philippines of the last several years of being a colony of Spain, being then a colony of the United States, because people do not leave their homeland and leave their loved ones and leave their family to toil in other parts of the world for pleasure. They usually leave because there were no other choice. Same for the Chinese. If it weren't for how poor China was at that time, And they were poor. There were internal reasons, but there were also external reasons. So I don't know how many of you learned in history book about the Opium War. There were 2 Opium Wars, and that was England forcing China to allow England to import opium into China. So China refusing another country to be the dope pusher into their country, they were called to war and they lost. And the result, they had to pay high indemnities, as well as allowing the foreign power to carve up their country. And that led to the reasons why people had to leave their homeland. And the Vietnam War led to the creation of new communities, Asian American communities in the United States. I was a member of the Hmong community. Well, that community was a huge tribe in Laos, and they end up settling in Minnesota. Why? And we have to understand that through understanding the CIA secret war in Southeast Asia at that time. So when Trump was railing against the Muslim refugees, we have to understand who created international events that led to these crises or refugees in the first place. So when we look at in 2021 anti-Asian hate, we have to be able to understand some of the underlying issues. One is that the fact that we really always being seen as foreigners because our history and our contributions were never recognized. So we are always someone else from another shore. Another reason is that we have to recognize that right now, as the United States declined in its economic power, that it has to find a scapegoat. Again, it's like the Japanese blaming the Japanese auto worker or auto industry for their competition against United States auto worker. Instead of looking at, well, how can we build a better automobile so that it will be marketable, it blamed other people. So I think when we look at the anti-Asian hate, we have to look at the international scapegoating that's going on at this time. So again, United States is a multi-ethnic nation on stolen land, and that's a history we have to recognize, and that the domestic and international events in history are in fact intertwined. And this is our teachable moment today.
Thank you, Dr. Wong. Rich, rich information. So Kimberly, we're going to turn to you for the last minutes.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you, Dr. Wong, for your great presentation. And I'm just gonna transition over to my presentation about Asian and Black solidarity, both historic and current day. And some of these points have been touched upon by Dr. Wong as well as mine. And for the sake of time, I'm going to keep my presentation on the shorter side. So I apologize in advance if I'm speaking a little bit faster. But during this presentation, we'll be sharing some resources in the chat, and we'll also be sharing a document of some other references that may be helpful. So with that, I'll just go ahead and get started. And oops. So why this topic? So like we all have noticed and understood, this past year, we've been hearing a lot of increase in anti-Asian hate and anti-Asian violence. And I really wanted to explore some positive examples of Asian Black unity, because oftentimes in mainstream media and in public discourse, we're kind of pitted against each other. And I also want to give a special shout out to Dr. Jan Mary Garcia, since I actually originally did this presentation as a part of her racism and health class in February of 2021. And why is it important to learn about this? So I think this article was shared earlier and Mai touched a little bit upon it, but oftentimes we as Asians are characterized as a model minority, and this kind of stereotype has covered up a lot of the history of solidarity between Asians and other folks of color, as well as our history of resistance over time. So let's go back into history and take a look at some examples. So the first example is actually one that Maya briefly mentioned. So Frederick Douglass actually gave the speech in 1867, which actually showed support for Chinese immigration as well as solidarity for other groups. So I'll just read really quickly a line that I found really meaningful. I want a home here, not only for the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, but I want the Asiatic to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here, both for his sake and for ours. And it's just great to really see that despite the anti-Chinese sentiment at this time, there are folks like Frederick Douglass speaking out. And then another thing that happened at the turn of the 20th century, Dr. Wong briefly mentioned this, but the Philippines actually was engaged in a Philippine-American War. And there were a lot of folks that were in the army that were of African-American descent that found this very ironic that even though they themselves didn't have full civil rights in the United States, they were expected to fight on behalf of the US to conquer another country. So a lot of folks either spoke out against this or sympathized with the Philippines and actually left the army because of that. And there's also a lot of Black leaders that also spoke up against this injustice as well. And this is a theme that we'll see as we go through the other examples. So internationally in the 1950s and 60s, so I didn't learn about this until recently, but there was a conference held in Indonesia in 1955, where it was a Pan-Asian African collection of many countries. Remember, at this time, it was a time of decolonization. So a lot of countries in Africa and Asia were just becoming independent and wanted to show solidarity with each other as well as oppose colonialism. Dr. Wong also mentioned the anti-Vietnam War protests, and I just want to give a mention of Dr. King, who spoke out against this, was actually very good friends with the Vietnamese Zen priest, Mr. Thich Nhat Hanh, who was also very much anti-war and very much against continued violence in Vietnam. And then domestically, we've touched upon the civil rights movement, where there's a lot of crosstalk between Asian Americans, African Americans, and other groups. And most notably, Yuri Kochiyama, which Mai had mentioned, was a very fierce activist at this time. She was a second-generation Japanese American whose family experienced internment and was actually a close friend of Malcolm X. And the Third World Liberation Front we kind of touched upon earlier, but just wanted to show all these collections of different groups coming together to fight for a common cause. And I mentioned Yuri earlier. Here's another picture of her. And then the Boggs were an interracial couple. James was African American. Grace was the daughter of Chinese immigrants who were married and very much involved in the civil rights, Black Power, and Asian American movements. And some of these slides are from the Bulaslan Center, which is actually the Center for Filipino American Studies here at UC Davis. And then Maya kind of touched upon this too. So this was something new that I learned. I always learned that I knew Jimmy Carter signed the Refugee Act that allowed my parents to come to the United States. And 1978 is really meaningful for me because that's the year when I know my parents and their families left Vietnam and started that refugee journey. But I didn't realize this until later, how Mr. Rustin and other Black civil rights leaders and other leaders in the community actually came together to advocate for Southeast Asian refugees, and actually had an ad that they bought and had printed in the New York Times. And really, I have to say, like, my existence here in this country wouldn't be possible without them. So just learning about this history is very moving to me. And then Dr. Wong had mentioned the killing of Vincent Chen in 1982. And of note, if you see in this picture, actually the Reverend Jesse Jackson came and showed support at one of the rallies. And here's Vincent Chen's mother. And I'll just read really quickly a quote by something he wrote recently about how he struck then by the way Lily Chin stood up and fought against this injustice. And all these organizers rose to organize against anti-Asian racial violence. They found community with African Americans, Latinos, and others, and forged alliances with people and organizations that have long been targets of racial violence. So again, another example of interracial solidarity between Black and Asian folks. And then just a prelude to this, this was an example in the wake of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. There was a community of Vietnamese and African Americans that lived closely together. And there's a research paper about them, but there's some illustrations that I got from online that kind of shows their shared solidarity with each other. So they both were getting displaced because of the hurricane. They organized together, and actually of note, their Catholic church, they were able to rebuild and regather really quickly and invited their Black neighbors to come and worship with them. And they often participated at community meetings with each other, and even protested against dumping of some trash in their area, and they won. that movement. So again, another example of Black and Asian solidarity. And of course, this presentation would not be complete without mention of the Black Lives Matter protests starting in 2014 in Ferguson. And this sign I just want to read really quickly. My fellow Asian Americans, our Black brothers and sisters bore the burden for us, so most of us and our families could be here with the Immigration Act of 1965. Prior to that, there were immigration quotas. It's time for us to stand and bear the burden with them. Black Lives Matter. And so this is some example of some things that UC Davis students have done. So in 2018, with the killing of Stephon Clark, we had a rally, and this is me with some friends more recently. And of course, want to shout out some of the younger first and second, third years that came together with SNMA and White Coats for Black Lives to show a racial justice report card, resulting in this dashboard that is now a part of the initiatives here at UC Davis Health. And another kind of grassroots effort that I wanted to highlight was around 2016, I saw online lots of Asian Americans with language skills wanting to come together and produce resources, both in video form as well as in text form, to kind of challenge anti-Blackness in their own communities and also educate a lot of their elders and people in their lives who may not know anyone who's Black, who may not understand this, to help educate them about why, for a lot of us younger Asian American folks, this Black Lives Matter movement is so important. And there are some resources being posted as I speak. And really quickly, in February, we had some rallies in Oakland and SF, as well as in New York, that was intergenerational and inter-ethnic coming together. And there's this unity letter. I would read it, but I know I'm running out of time. So you could see there's a lot of talk about unity and working together to stop violence collectively. And this is a town hall. There will be a link to it. The recording was really meaningful for me, just seeing this cross conversation between Asian and Black folks together to think about solidarity and working together in the future. And this is my last slide, so I apologize again, trying to get through everything. So Asian Health Services was one of the many health groups that came out of the civil rights movement. I just want to kind of read really briefly that last year they met with Ms. Lewis, first female member of the Black Panther Party, who co-designed these unity shirts. And they purchased a set of shirts for the staff and board and had discussions on what Black Asian solidarity can look like in our communities, and not just through shirts and posters. We stand stronger, united in solidarity. And I just want to show an African American group had donated money to Asian Health Services in light of all the violence that's been going on. So I just kind of want to summarize and show that really, truly, we have so many examples of Asian Black solidarity over time. This is not a comprehensive list. I encourage folks to continue reading, continue learning. There's a link to a 40-minute video by the Smithsonian that's really great and very in-depth. And there are other folks of color like South Asians and Latinx and other people I didn't talk about specifically, but just know there's that history of struggle together and unity together. And I would encourage folks to continue learning just like myself and continue finding ways to figure out how can we make impact, how can we make change, maybe in little things like our workplaces or talking with family, but things where you can use your strength to make something sustainable and make something worth continuing to fight for the long term. And this is something for me that's really inspirational for me as I kind of look forward to my residency and future practice to use medicine as an avenue for social change. So with that, I think my time is up. Thank you so much to everyone for listening. And again, we'll be sending some resources out as well.
Thank you so much, Kimberly and Dr. Wong. The resources have been just filled into the chat box, so everyone has that for their education and their awareness, to lift up your consciousness and to continue to pick up the baton as a multicultural ethnic movement forward to support every population possible. The US is embedded in racism. The history and resources that we've shared with you is clear on that. And now it's time to move together in this effort. For the last minute, I'm going to turn to Dr. Tan for last words.
I want to thank everybody on this panel and give special thanks also to Mercedes, who was a great facilitator, and the HEDI team that provided our tech support. Thank you so much to Dr. Wong and soon to be Dr. Ngo for the incredible presentation, really speaking about the importance of history and international events and how they give us context to understand and to move forward as a united community against racism in the States. I also want to give thanks and appreciation to everybody who participated here. It's, from a personal standpoint, it touches my heart to know that there are people who are, allies in our endeavors against racism and social injustice. So thank you very much. Turning it back to Mercedes now.
Thank you, Dr. Tan. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees. And we continue to work forward to grow as a community. We will see you next month on our next webcast. Thank you so much and good night.